Today on TwinCam, we're looking at what is probably the cutest sports car of all time, and one of the few cars that, thanks to its cultural status, has received a universal nickname. This is the Mark I Austin-Healey Sprite, the Frogeye Sprite. One of the most iconic historic sports car marques, Austin-Healey existed as a partnership between Austin, then part of BMC, and Donald Healey's small sports car company based in Warwickshire. The first Austin-Healey, the 100, was launched in 1953, and by 1956, Healey and Leonard Lord, then president of BMC, met to discuss the future of their partnership. Healey was keen on a new project to work on, while BMC wanted a replacement for the old MGTF, which had been superseded by the more expensive MGA. The problem was that BMC wanted a new, smaller, less expensive sports car to sit somewhere close to their Morris Minor in terms of pricing. For a bit of context, the old MGTF cost £780 when it was discontinued, while the new MGA was all the way up at £894. This would fill a niche at the bottom of the market and increase BMC's hold over the sports car segment, one in which they were world leaders. In fact, Britain couldn't keep up with demand. Healey's company set to work on a project led by his son Geoffrey, and the whole point of the car was to use as much existing BMC componentry as possible. The Sprite was launched in the correct manner for a sports car, in Monte Carlo just before the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix. The new small Healey cost a mere £669, a whole 327 quid less than the existing MGA. The result was this charming little fella, and we should of course start with the styling. The Sprite was penned by Jerry Coker, and it's a very simple shape. Compare it to the contemporary MGA and it's much simpler with far less features and frills. The body pressings were kept to an absolute minimum, but that is not at the expense of personality. At the rear, you don't even get a full bumper, just these little chrome overriders, and the rear lamps are just existing units. Even the badging is simple, just this little stylised Sprite badge. From the side, there is virtually nothing, not even a straight swage line or a kick-up at the rear. It's not just utilitarian, but it's utterly Spartan. The front end is where we see the majority of that personality, but again with ruthless simplicity. From the factory, these cars did come with a full-length front bumper, but so many of them have had them removed that they almost look standard the way that this one does. It just has these little edges that pick up the edges of the clamshell and point towards the indicators. The grille and headlamps though are what we're all here for, and they're the reason that this car is so recognisable. It has such an endearing little face, clearly designed to be as cute as possible, but these Frogeye headlamps were not supposed to be the features they became. This style of design is unique to the Sprite, and it exists thanks to your typical BMC cost cutting. The original design called for a set of pop-up headlamps, but not as you'd expect. Instead, in the style of the Lamborghini Miura and Porsche 928, where the headlamp stays visible but pops up forwards out of the bodywork. These lamps are just that design, but without the mechanism, so they're always popped up. At some point in the Sprite's development, BMC decided that it wasn't worth the effort, but in true BMC fashion, they didn't touch the design. They just left the headlamps exactly as they were. However, BMC's cost cutting did make a positive difference to the Sprite. It may have been slightly impractical, but it was such a pure little sports car, and it was cheap. For 1958, the Sprite had a pioneering platform as it was a monocoque, making it the first ever widely produced sports car to have a unitary construction. There are elements of a chassis with rails supporting the front end, but otherwise this was completely fresh. In order to increase the rigidity of that monocoque, there is no boot lid. This is a sports car, not a practical car. Additionally, there is no bonnet, but with those big chassis rails there's no need, so the whole front end is a clamshell that lifts to reveal the engine that powered Britain, the utterly wonderful BMC A-Series 4-cylinder petrol engine. This is the engine that made millions of cars across the world as good as they were, including the Morris Minor, the Mini and all kinds of later small BMC sports cars. In this form it displaces 948cc, so it's a tiny little capacity, but it is equipped with twin SU carburettors at a tiny 1 1/8 of an inch. That being said, it still only produces 43 horsepower and 52 pound-feet of torque. 0 to 60 takes over 20 seconds and the top speed is about 82 miles per hour. This can of course be caveated by the curb weight of the Sprite, only 664 kilograms. But having said that, this was still a tiny amount of power for a sports car in 1958, and a little disappointing to those wanting a bit more. The disappointment continues with drum brakes all round, though it was still very uncommon to find any normal car with discs. And that's what the Sprite was. A sports car for normal car money, built with normal car components. Along that line, the steering and suspension is pure Morris Minor and Austin A35. The steering is rack and pinion of course, with independent suspension. Wishbones with coil springs and lever arm dampers. The back is completely standard, a live axle on leaf springs. And between the suspension and the road are 13-inch wheels with a 145 section tyre. 145! That's proper bicycle spec. All those engineering facts become clearer though when we look at the scale. When I refer to this little car, I'm not talking about its cute face or its tiny engine, but look at the scale here. I'm only about 5'9" and this car is properly tiny. So, let's see how one can fold themselves into a Sprite. You may have noticed that there are no door handles because the only way to get into the Sprite is by unlatching them from inside like this. A bit like the original Dodge Viper, and that's the only time you'll ever hear a Frogeye Sprite compared to a Viper. And once you're in, we can see where all this seemingly empty space goes. The boot is accessible, but you have to slide things in behind the seats. The interior is properly petite, but it all works really, really well. These seats do slide back and forth, but this seat is already in kind of the correct driving position for me at 5'9". And considering just how tiny it is, it does make brilliant use of its space inside. There's plenty of elbow room thanks to the fact that there are no door cards, and there's loads of little storage space as well as the big boot behind you. Of course, there are no seat belts because, well, it's 1958 or 1960 for when this one was built, and the seats do just fly forwards, but that's the 1950s for you. The seats are slightly bucketed, so you sit quite low and they do hold you quite a bit compared to any kind of normal car seats from the era. The steering wheel is pretty much right in front of you, just a little bit kinked over, but again completely normal. And the pedals are shifted a little bit to the right, but the seat also sits to the right, so the pedals are in a really nice natural position with the throttle and brake perfectly positioned for heel and toe gear changes. The gear lever is right next to the steering wheel, so it is really easy to go over and change gear. And as much as first gear, which doesn't have synchromesh by the way, is over in a different postcode somewhere that way, second, third and fourth are all right close to each other, just as they should be in a little sports car. So everything here in terms of driving feels so well designed, and in terms of how big this feels, you know, I've got plenty of space between myself and my passenger, plenty of elbow room, and of course the world all around me. The dashboard is literally that far away from my hands, but why does it need to be any further away? But where we see even more simplicity is in the controls. So this dashboard is exceptionally basic. The steering wheel is an aftermarket unit. The original, I think, would have been a big Baker-like two-spoke job, but this one kind of suits the 50s, 60s British sports car thing, as does the wooden gear knob. The tachometer was an optional extra, as was the heater that we see here. But to the right there is a speedometer and a fuel gauge, and then a double water temperature and oil pressure gauge there. The controls are kind of all smattered around the dashboard just over here, but they are absolutely everything you need and nothing that you don't. So the ignition switch is in the centre with the headlamps for side and head around them. As I said, the heater fan is there, and the starter motor, make sure we're in neutral, is on a pull switch there. Obviously it won't start without the ignition though. You have your wipers with this switch, the choke all the way over here, which does seem a bit of an odd place to put an essential driving control, and your manual pump for your washers. This switch up here though is the one that a lot of people, even in the late 50s, early 60s, may find the most alien, because this is your indicators. There are no stalks whatsoever behind the steering wheel. But this is, despite a reputation for British sports cars for being quite cramped and a little claustrophobic and slightly badly designed really, this is a fantastic little driving position for a car that is so tiny. You sit very, very low in it. My eye line is just at the windscreen wiper. So you don't feel like you're sat on top of it at all, you feel like you're sat in it as part of the car. And the gear lever is right close to the steering wheel, and the pedals are all very close together. You can't see your oil pressure gauge or your water temperature gauge or your fuel gauge or the bottom of your tachometer or the bottom of your speedometer while you're driving, but it doesn't matter. Despite its tiny power and simple underpinnings, the Sprite was an amazing little sports car, and it lived its life as a popular tiny racing car. But right back in 1959, 3 Frogeyes were entered in the 12 Hours of Sebring, finishing first, second and third in their class. BMC only produced the Frogeye for 3 years, from 1958 to 1961. Though in that time they did make nearly 50,000, so they aren't exactly rare, especially thanks to the fact that they were always enthusiast cars and that they're so bloody cute. The legacy of this car continues with the later Sprites and the badge-engineered MG Midget, which were based on this very car, running all the way through to 1980 and becoming one of the world's favourite small sports cars. The Frogeye Sprite is not just a tiny, short-lived sports car made recognisable by its cute face, but it's the exemplar of how the British could make very normal underpinnings into a sports car the world loved for decades. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I also now have a Patreon page, so if you'd like to pledge a little bit of money towards me making these videos better, then please do. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.